linked to the MOBILISE project that's funded by the GCRF that myself and Tom Indus are leading in Sri Lanka, Malaysia and Pakistan. So really looking forward to listening to Richard's context and frameworks. So
that's great. Thanks, thanks very much. Terence asked me first of all if I'm from computer science, so I should probably explain amongst all those acronyms where who I am and kind of where I work. I started off many years ago, genuinely, when we were programming with zeros and ones. So it was many years ago, working for ICL, working as a programmer for some time. So I was an IT guy, and then I went and did voluntary service overseas for a couple of years in Nigeria, and I got really interested in development and developing countries, and came back to the UK, and after a couple of meanders, put them together to make up a PhD and then to make up an academic career. So that's kind of my background, that I was originally a techie, and then I've moved over now, and I'm pretty much wholly a social scientist. As Terence said, I'm director of the Centre for Development Informatics at the University of Manchester. We're about 30 researchers and staff and doctoral students, and around about 100 master's students, with particular interests around digital and development, the role of ICTs in socioeconomic development in the global south. And amongst the various strands that we're interested in is a particular strand around digital resilience, whatever that means. We shall perhaps find out. This is a little mapping of the literature on resilience, and you'll see that trying to get a grip on resilience is kind of probably a shortcut to insanity, because probably in just the last 3 years more has been written about resilience than has been written in all the previous years, and well, you can spot the shape of the graph. So there's really an explosion of work on resilience. The reason for that, of course, is there's been an explosion in real-world interest and real-world practice around resilience, and the academic trend is following that. Real-world, lots and lots of major programs around resilience, and more than that, resilience really entering, at least in my domain, international development, really entering the mainstream as an important concept. Quite a worrying concept in some senses, because I think up until 10 years ago or so, we had this sense of development in the world as just a sort of an onward progression. Now we're starting to be worried about the possibility of slipping backwards. That's where resilience really comes in, because it's resilience against the kind of the dangers that nations and communities and so on may slip backwards, and this idea that ever continuing progress is not necessarily the trajectory. What am I summarising from that literature about what resilience is? Lots of ways you can summarise the literature, but one way is to say that some of the literature sees resilience as a property, a capacity of a particular system. Some of it sees resilience as a process, something that a system actually does, a function of a system, that it's resilience in practice. Some of the literature sees resilience as a state or as an outcome. So, for example, if a system has survived a shock of some kind, then it is resilient. So those are the three main different ways in which the literature has been using resilience. And then over and above that, we have this notion that resilience is this new way of thinking about not slipping backwards, about adaptation, about shocks, about stresses. So it's a discourse within the literature, and of course it's also a discourse very much within planning and within development. What I'm going to present to you is a particular way of thinking about resilience. It's not a completely original approach to resilience, it's drawing together threads from that literature, and that conceptualization of resilience says this is the foundational understanding of resilience. The foundational understanding of resilience is to understand it as the property of a system. And what kind of systems are we talking about? Could be at any kind of a level. Typically, you'll see it operationalized in the level of a community, but it could be lower than that as a household, it could be higher than that. a city, a nation, the whole world. And of course, as well, there's the literature on individual resilience as well, that comes out of psychology. One of the things that we've been trying to ensure within the work that we do is that we try to encompass those multiple levels of resilience, particularly incorporating the notion of individual resilience by measuring resilience in terms of the responses that individuals give. Why is that? Because there's good evidence that subjective feelings about resilience amongst individuals in a community are a key determinant of the overall resilience of that community. And so if we can tap into those subjective understandings of resilience, so much the better. Resilience then is a property of a system and something that helps those systems to withstand external disturbances, shocks and stresses. So our starting point for why we want to look at resilience is by looking ahead to the 21st century, or the rest of the 21st century. If we look ahead to the rest of the 21st century, we can tell that there are going to be an increasing number of external shocks and stresses on any system. It's integral to the fact that the world is becoming, and that systems within the world are becoming more interconnected, significantly because of digital technologies, and therefore we're seeing this amplification and these cascade effects of shocks. So we're going to see systems subject to more and more shocks. The shock that often we would think about is disasters, but it's not just those. Think of what's happened in the last 10 years, or 5 years. Political shocks, economic shocks, shocks of violence, shocks of migration. Or more day-to-day, we can talk of the language perhaps not so much of shocks as the language of stresses on a system, increasing economic, financial, social, cultural, political, and environmental pressures. And of course, we've got the big one for the 21st century, the longer-term trend of climate change. And all of these external shocks and stresses serve to increase the vulnerabilities that communities already experience. And I'm particularly interested, my work is particularly, not necessarily on that kind of rural location, but I'm interested in low-income communities in developing countries. Why? Because they are on the front line of all of these kinds of shocks. They're on the front line of climate change. They're the ones who are most vulnerable to climate change, but they're also the ones who are most vulnerable to many of the other shocks and stresses that are going to hit communities during the 21st century. Sure, we should be interested in the global north as well and communities here, but by and large, we're probably going to be largely okay because we have the resources and the resilience to stand up better against these kind of shocks and stresses. That is not the case for those communities which are already significantly vulnerable. So the priority, I would argue, is building up the resilience of these low-income communities against the shocks and the stresses that are coming up for them. Well, then I've kind of given away the point that what do we need in order to address these shocks and these stresses that are coming up? We need to build resilience. How are we going to define resilience? Defined there as, definition you'll find everywhere, the capacity of a system to withstand, to recover from, and to adapt to short-term shocks and also longer-term change. And as I said, we're talking about various kinds of system. What we're trying to achieve with our conceptualization is a relatively universally applicable model, something that could be applied to any type of system. I don't know yet whether it can apply beyond communities because we've only tried it in communities, but I'd certainly be interested to look at other kinds of units, districts, cities, organizations, value chains, and so on. Looking at the, that definition in a little more detail, we can see that what resilience consists of is three particular things, or our definition, three particular things, which is withstanding these external disturbances, recovering from those external disturbances when they do kind of get inside the system and cause a problem, but also adapting to those longer term changes. There's a lot of discussion around the definitions of resilience. I mean, I apologise because I don't know how much about resilience you know as an audience. Maybe this is all very well packed for you, or the least is explaining where I'm coming from. But as you may know, almost all definitions of resilience incorporate the notion of withstanding and recovering. Some definitions go on to incorporate the idea of adapting, and a very few incorporate the idea of transformation. I'm not going to talk a lot about transformation, but a key criticism of resilience and a key problem for resilience is, does it mean stasis? Does it mean that we keep the poor resiliently poor? Does it mean that we keep those who are marginalised in our current economic and political systems resiliently marginalised? Other people critique resilience as being just a sop to neoliberalism as a way of continuing the current neoliberal system by just doing enough to keep those who are marginalised by that system, to keep them going. So there's a lot of discussion around the notion that we should incorporate into resilience the idea of transforming, that we need to think about systems changing from one state to another state and transforming the inequalities and the exclusions and so on. We have actually incorporated, as you'll see in a bit, something of that into our understanding of resilience, but it's a debate that's currently ongoing, particularly because there are also tensions potentially between what you need in order to stay as you are and what you need to change in order to become something different. Okay, so I've explained the definition of resilience that we're using, and I've explained some of the rationale for resilience. I'm going to move on next to talk about the specifics of what we did about this in the field. But before I do that, has anybody got any questions or anything they're not quite understanding, or anything they don't agree with? Anybody got any questions they'd like to ask about what I've talked about so far, which is the foundational understanding of where we're coming from in resilience terms?
Richard, in the previous slide, you talked about system, and then you put some keywords like households, communities, and things
value
like
chain
that.
organisation.
Yeah, but if you consider city as a complex system, there are much more complex interaction between built environment, nature, and so on. So I was wondering whether you have your own definition for what system means within the context of a city.
Yeah, I mean, we've taken a relatively bottom-up notion of systems, which is kind of self-defined by the members of that particular system. What do they recognise as the boundaries and scope? So within a city, you could define the city as a system, albeit, as you say, a very complex system indeed. It would be determined if the members of that, stakeholders within that system, recognised it in some sense as something with a boundary and subsystems and emergent properties and all the other components that we use when we define a system. There are particular issues around urban resilience, certainly, and urban resilience has tended to come from a slightly different direction. I was reading a couple of things yesterday, actually, specifically about urban resilience, and perhaps because of its complexity, it has tended to use a slightly different approach to this. The common approach is the one I'm going to present now, which is around capacities of the system, and then also assets within the system. But a number of the city and urban resilience literature has tended to take a rather different perspective on that, perhaps reflecting the complexity of it and also the relatively higher level of those systems. But if you're asking me, I see no reason why one couldn't apply a systems and properties approach to the level of a city. Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Excuse me, I'm considered on communicated with has digital and then having something and lost, or consider on community don't have any idea about the system. There are two groups. Which one?
Sorry, so take it again. What are the two alternatives?
Are you consider on the community has digital technology, and then some haven't, and then lost this technology, and then recover again.
Okay, fine.
This group, and another group, community don't have any idea about development in digital?
Okay, I think these days one would struggle to find a community that isn't digitally connected in some way. I mean, of course, there are somewhere, but you know, as an example, last week I was up in Edinburgh examining a PhD about the use of mobiles by the Maasai, who are nomadic pastoralists. They don't even live in, necessarily, they don't live in one place in a village. They're using mobiles quite significantly in their work. So I think these days, and that's why the ideas of digital resilience is now got some salience. I think you would struggle to find those kinds of communities. So digital is there now within those communities, and that's why we see this kind of interaction between the two. Okay, so thanks for those two. So this was our starting point a couple of years ago, which was that we were working in an urban district in the capital of Costa Rica, San Jose, and we were working in a coffee farming district in Uganda. And in both of those cases, we were particularly interested there, not in all of those shocks that I indicated, we were particularly interested in climate change, because both of these communities were already experiencing some impacts of climate change. So increasing number of adverse weather events, increasing floods, frequency or severity of floods and landslides, longer term issues around availability of water, particularly longer term issues. Here, this is around Mount Elgon, it's coffee growing, seeing changes in patterns of seasonality, patterns of cropping, locations of cropping as well. So these are not the poorest of the poor, because these are coffee farmers, so they have some level of income. This is a low middle income community. We were restricted for the safety of our researchers in terms of the communities we were able to go into in San Jose. And we chose them, coming back to the second question, we did check that there was already some relatively significant level of use of ICTs in those communities, and then we checked as well that they were seeing the impacts of climate change. So our particular interest, because I'm coming from the Centre for Development Informatics, the particular interest was not resilience overall, but to understand what is the impact of information and communication technologies, of ICTs, particularly mobiles, also internet access to some extent. What is the impact, what's the relationship between ICTs and resilience in those communities? And in particular, what we were wanting to do was to set up priority plans for both of these sets of communities on what should be their top priorities for applying ICTs to strengthen resilience within their community. So that was our task. Set an action plan prioritising what should be the highest priority use of ICTs to improve resilience. We started by reviewing various models of resilience. And from these, we extracted 8 attributes. You can call them sub-properties of the system. 8 attributes of resilience that repeatedly appear. And what we're trying to do here is, there's a lot of criticism of the field of resilience, that it's very fragmented, lots and lots of different models. What we were trying to do is to integrate together all the models that we could find and create a comprehensive model that would overlap with all the other models we found, but draw together all the elements. So these are the 8 elements that we found and drew together from that integrated to create this. Particularly, this is coming from a socio-ecological perspective, and of course, it's coming from a systems perspective. And out of the review we did, we divided the attributes. I'm still a little unsure whether this really works or not. We certainly had review comments sort of saying, I think we should take this out. Others saying, yeah, they think it works. I'm still not totally sure. But we've divided them into 2 sets of attributes. So the first 3 are foundational attributes. You find these pretty well in all discussions about resilience, and we see them as the core of understanding what a system must be if it's going to be resilient. robustness, self-organisation, and learning. So these are 3 sub-properties that we found in almost all cases. And then we've got a set of enabling attributes, sub-properties, that you don't always find and which can contribute towards the strength of these others. Redundancy, rapidity, scale, flexibility and diversity, and that one that I said we'd added in order to at least give some nod to the issue of transformation. We incorporated equality as well.
So could I ask you, I mean, how did you extract these characteristics? Was there any kind of discussion through kind of work groups or something? How did you extract this?
It was basically a literature review. It was a literature review and just sort of doing a matrix of, well, this one's got these, this one's got these, and eventually we reached an aggregation of those 8 altogether, which of course we did then discuss. And having been into the field with them, well, I can talk a little bit about implementing them in practice, but I'm relatively comfortable with them, having put them into practice with the pilot studies, that, albeit with some modifications, that they are fairly comprehensive. We didn't find anything in the field that we thought, oh, this is a component of resilience, and the attributes don't.
So my understanding is when it comes to resilience measurement, resilience of frameworks, they also come from different angles. Some from very poverty sort of the angle, some from very asset sort of the angle, and some from very network oriented kind of angle. So did you look into all those different resilience framework to try and come up with these attributes?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say if you review the literature, the preponderance of frameworks is those which are capacity based, as these are. Then, as you said, there are others which look at networks. There are others that look at assets. I've got to be honest, I'm still thinking through the implications of that. What do we do? Actually, I'm thinking it through in reality, because the digital resilience work we're about to do, potential partners in South Africa are coming at it from a network perspective, and we're trying to think, well, how do we integrate those? My answer would be, I see capacities as the foundational concept, and I see them as being enacted through subsystems, of which networks could be one. So you can readily see how networks would fit in, and you'll see them more clearly a bit later on, but you can readily see how networks would link into notions of self-organisation and scale. And that those subsystems mobilise assets. So I can see a sort of an overall picture of capacities enacted through subsystems, including networks, that mobilise resources in order to put resilience into practice. And if you look underneath these, there are assets underneath these as we'll see. We'll see in a moment. Okay. Then we needed to define what exactly the system was, what was the scope of our study, and as I've said, we took it in a relatively self-defining manner. So we went in, talked to people in this area in San Jose. They were in a district called Barrio Lujan. They defined themselves as a community. We talked to people in Uganda. There was a set of coffee farming cooperatives and households. They defined themselves as a community. So we took this. I'm not an interpretivist myself, but actually I've kind of realised we took a somewhat bottom-up and we're taking a somewhat interpretive perspective on resilience. I can talk more about the ontology of it all. I believe we're taking a critical realist perspective on resilience. Okay, so what did these 8 attributes mean in practice? First of all, then, robustness is the ability of the system to withstand shocks and to continue operating. So, for instance, typically in a community that might involve physical infrastructure, such as the storm drains that enable it to continue operating in the face of extreme weather events. Self-organisation, the ability of the community, particularly via local groups, to rearrange activities within the community in response to problems. Learning, the ability of the community to build on existing knowledge, but to build new knowledge around solutions and problems. Redundancy, surplus capacity within the community, that can be called upon in the event of disruption. So an example here, this is a cyber cafe. You can imagine that's redundant in certain ways. If people's smartphones or their home internet connections have problems, then they have this additional line of connection. Rapidity, speed of detection and response to problems. We thought the local community fire department illustrated that quite well. Scale is about the extent of links from within the community to wider organisations that can provide assets. So this is the very modest Costa Rican National Assembly, but there were links to regional and international organisations from within the community. Diversity and flexibility, the ability to take different courses of action with the resources that you have. I think of a particularly good illustration, but this is a shop which is able to sell itself as being a bookshop, and it's a copy shop, and it's also an internet cafe as well. And finally, equality, the extent to which everybody has equal access to resources and also to opportunities. This picture, a reminder that resilient attributes are maybe weak as well as strong because there was some level of inequality within the community. Here's an example of relatively poor quality housing, which you can compare to the relatively good quality housing in the other parts of the community. So, we've sorry.
So I was going to ask,
yeah.
The scale, how do you define scale again? Is that the kind of a coordination aspect from national to regional to
it's the linkages that it's on the So we've got resilience. We define it as a capacity or various capacities, sub-properties of systems. These are all in theory measurable, but how do we actually go about measuring them in practice? So what we then did is again, initially top-down as a review from existing literature. Again, I've got comments on that, having taken it out into the field. We took each one of these resilience attributes in turn, and we identified 3 markers, 3 much more specific components that we might find within the community that we could use in order to measure using field instruments like interviews and surveys. These markers are not particularly well defined. So in terms of scale, breadth of assets and structures and system access, defined it in terms of the scale of resources that the community has access to and multi-level and intra-level networks within the community itself. So the networks out intra-level within the community itself. You might already spot there's a slight issue here. What's the difference between intra-level networks and social networks? So the paper that recently published in Information Systems Journal, part of what it discusses is some of the issues that arose with these when we took them out into the field. But the idea, though, is we've got these relatively conceptual notions of what systems should be, what communities should be, what organisations. How can we actually make that work in practice? We can create a set of markers. We did that top-down. There are many other ways in which one could have developed these markers. As an example, another time I might well just go into the community with these general concepts and get the communities themselves to develop their own markers. Or we could do a kind of, at least an iterative process of starting with the markers, but not just going into the field with them, discussing with the community. But just as an example of the kinds of things that we could then go out and talk to people in the community about, collaborative decision making. To what extent are decisions in and around the community made collaboratively or made by individuals from top down? What is the extent of social networks in the community? How do people feel about their social networks, their social capital? Do they feel well embedded in the community or do they feel relatively isolated? What's the nature of local leadership within the community? Is it strong? Is it authoritarian? Is it relatively democratic? Is it absent? So there's a set of questions that we can ask. So turning these markers into specific indicators that will be usable in the field. if it wasn't complex enough, this is where we also had to make, we could use this in two ways. We can use this model to do one of two things. We can either use it to measure resilience, or we can measure E-resilience, the relationship or the impact of ICTs on resilience. For this first exercise, we decided to do both at the same time. So we actually had quite a lot of intensive field activity, because what we were trying to do simultaneously was to benchmark what's the general resilience levels of the community, and secondly, what are the specific role of ICTs in the community vis-à-vis resilience. And the reason we did that is because we wanted to put those together in order to set the priorities for future uses of ICT in the community. How did we go about it? Fairly obvious stuff. We did a set of surveys. Those particularly talked to people about their use of ICTs, how they related to those different markers. We did a set of semi-structured interviews talking more generally to people about resilience within the community, and we did a set of focus groups as well, talking about both things, about resilience generally and also about the use of ICTs. I haven't got time to go through all of the findings, you'll be pleased to know. I'm just going to give a couple of illustrations, one about benchmarking resilience, and one about benchmarking resilience. So here's the first of my illustrative visualizations. What we did, using the text from our semi-structured interviews, and also to some degree also from the focus groups, we coded the statements in relation to the attributes of resilience, and we coded them as to whether they were positive statements about the strength of the community or a negative about a weakness within the community, and then we just added them. Rather rough and ready, but it gave us this, which is an overall sense of the strength or weakness of specific attributes within the community. So for example, for redundancy, there were 44 more positive than negative comments. As a result of that, we would tend to say, okay, in our prioritization exercise that's coming up, we would tend to place redundancy as a lower priority. By contrast, when people were talking about the extent of equality within the community, there were as many positive as negative statements. For the speed at which the community was able to identify problems and react to them, slightly more negative. So these then become higher priorities. These are the weaker components of resilience within the community. These are the ones that we should target for future action. Now, we could have just used that. But as I say, we also ask questions about the role of ICTs. This visualization is more complex because instead of dealing with it at the level of the attributes, we've actually broken it down into the level of the specific markers. Green sectors are those that are already fairly well served by ICTs, and so they're a relatively low priority for future action. So, for example, here, as you might expect, there's quite significant use already of ICTs to support social networks within the community, so we didn't feel that that was really a priority for future action. Yellow segments mean that there is some use of ICTs, but there will be room for improvement. So here's one, resource spareness, the extent to which people were using ICTs to obtain additional resources, which we particularly thought of in terms of money, and we're particularly thinking of what they interpreted it, I should say, particularly in terms of use of mobile money systems. There was some, but it was by no means universal. Red were ICT applications in which ICTs was not really having a great deal of influence. So for example, that one here is in terms of the use of ICTs to be looking for climate-related information. So the red elements become our high priorities, the yellows become our mid priorities, the greens become our low priorities. As I say, we could have used either one of these individually to set our priorities, but what we wanted to do was to integrate them, so to bring together the data on resilience in the community and the data on e-resilience in the community. So then what we're looking for in terms of our high priorities is attributes and markers that are both weak, seen as weak overall within the community, and in which ICTs are not making much of a contribution either. Now obviously there'll be some overlap between the two, but we thought that integrating those two together would be more appropriate. Because what you don't want to do is to be advocating something, oh, this is a high priority for use of ICTs, you're not using it very much at the moment, when the community is telling you, but this is already a strength of the community, and which indeed might explain why ICTs are not much used, because they're not much needed in that. So we wanted to integrate those two components together.
So Richard, how did you construct this framework? Because you've got different parameters, isn't it? So how did that come?
So this is these. Each one of the segments is one of these. So that's what it comes out of. And we asked questions about nearly each one of these. Another one of our difficulties that we ran into was asking too many questions. So you'll see that some of them we weren't able to. They got dropped out of our survey. But we asked people specific questions, one or sometimes two, for each one of these markers, to ask them specifically about how is ICT being used at the moment and what impact has it had on this particular element. Another issue that we would think about more carefully and do better next time is that those are two slightly different things. One is how is ICT being used, and the other is what impact are ICTs actually having. It's the latter one that we want really to know about, and we probably asked a little bit too much about the first one. These are all part of the many things that we learn by going into the field and making use of this. So that's how each one of those is constructed, and then the numbers are just the priorities: 1, 2, 1 high priority, 2 medium, 3 low. And we've also aggregated at the level of the overall attributes, the 8 attributes which are there in the centre of the circle.
Sorry.
Yeah.
The previous diagram, the one you showed, so it's based on the markers you asked from the people, respondents, whether they feel it as positive. Say for example, one of the markers is institutional capacity.
Yeah.
So to see whether under robustness, to see whether the institutions have the capacity to respond in case of an emergency. Whether they feel positively or negatively.
Yeah. What do they feel, for example, about? So we asked in Costa Rica, for example, about the local fire department and local other emergency services and so on, and their abilities to help. And yeah, that's right. Focus group particularly, we didn't of course ask them these individual marker level questions. We got to talk more generally about issues related to the attributes, and of course very obviously we didn't go into them and say, tell us about robustness in the community, tell us about self-organisation. Of course, we naturally interpreted those in terms that the people in the communities themselves would understand. And that was part of the literature process that, of course, we piloted all of these things and started to understand what some of the language that would map onto our conceptual understandings of resilience in terms of the local community. So one of the problems, challenges here, not challenge. One of the things we must recognise here is because we're using a relatively interpretive and bottom-up understanding of resilience, you can't really benchmark across communities. We can't say, I haven't got the data to show you, but as an example, the Ugandan community was far more positive about resilience within their community than the Costa Rican community. That looks odd to me, because the Costa Rican community was better off. So I'm not sure, this hasn't given us a tool for cross comparisons between communities, but it will give us a longitudinal tool within a particular community.
Do you think this result shows that their beliefs of resilience rather than their resilience?
Well, yeah, it shows it does, of course. It's an interpretive approach. But coming back to my point, I was arguing about the role of the link between individual to household to community resilience clearly individual action is the foundation of resilience within a community, and so I think what's valuable about this, I kind of worried it was a weakness because it's not quantified in a positivist sense, but actually I now see that as something of a strength, that we're tapping into those subjective understandings, because there is good evidence that what people feel about resilience materialises into action about whether or not their community is resilient. And we could go to a more quantified, and I mean, there are various directions you can take this. You can take this in a more bottom-up and interpretive direction. For example, you can just go in and, without any attributes, and just talk to people about capacities and get them talking about things. Or you could go mid-range, you could go with the attributes and ask people to develop their own markers. Or one could go in a more positivist and objective perspective and start setting some specific indicators against those attributes that we could use to measure across communities. So there's a number of directions one could take this in. Right, yeah, so we combined the benchmarking of resilience, the benchmarking of e-resilience, and we then came up with a set of which do we see as, out of what you, the community, have told us, are the highest priorities for action areas. And then we presented those priorities back to the community. We got them to discuss. We didn't necessarily impose them. They could tell us, oh, actually, we don't think that is a particular priority. And then we got them to think, for those that they took on and as high priority areas, we got them to think about, right, what should we do? What is the highest priority for using ICTs in this community to strengthen resilience? So here's just a sample of the table from the Uganda case study. We identified who is going to be involved with this action. Is it community, local government, national level? And here were the ideas. So here's use of social networks to have a multi-level discussion around the impacts of climate change in their particular area. They wanted a better connection with FuseNet, which is a food security information system that operates in developing countries. The people were aware of it, but they didn't have good connections to the information that it provided, and they wanted more, and so on and so forth. We come up with a set of, with an action plan. So that, we finally kind of got back to what I said was our starting point, which is a prioritized set of actions for how best to use ICTs to improve the resilience of these particular communities. So, I managed to get through that without mentioning what RABIT is. Yes, I should have said. So RABIT is the Resilience Assessment, Benchmarking and Impact Toolkit, and it is the set of survey, focus group, interview instruments that we use, and that anybody can use because it's on the website, can be used to measure the markers and attributes of resilience and to set up one of these exercises. What I've presented is a sort of slightly strange, in relation to the project cycle, what I've presented is a bit of a strange amalgam, because in some ways we were being post hoc, because we were asking people, well, what has been the impact of ICTs to date? Then we were asking them also sort of mid hoc, what's the current status of resilience within the community and e-resilience, and then we were also looking for future actions as well. And the point here then is that RABIT is applicable, we believe, anywhere in the project cycle. So you can use it at the project planning stage, which I suppose the majority of what we were doing can be seen as project planning, because we're setting the design and priorities for future uses of ICTs in the community. One can use it mid-project, so to assess where are we now with the use of ICTs and resilience, and how might that want to change the direction of the project in the future. And one can use it at the end of a project to evaluate the impact of ICTs or any other intervention on resilience. Of course, if you're doing that, ideally, you would have also done a pre-hoc benchmarking of resilience in the community, and then you can map the before and after extent to which resilience has changed, and hopefully do some attribution that links that changes in resilience to the project that you have been involved in. this is where we are now with RABIT. We have we've tested it in 2 field case studies. We've demonstrated that it is a practical mechanism for understanding and for operationalizing and for measuring resilience in development projects, including the resilience, the impact of ICTs on resilience in development projects. And we're now at a stage of looking for partner projects and partner organisations to make further use of it. Either those who are looking to, per the project cycle before, either those who are interested in benchmarking resilience in order to plan future actions and future priorities, or those who are looking to measure the impact of digital technologies on community resilience or organisational resilience or supply chain resilience. If you'd like to know a little more about this from an academic perspective, then please take a look at this paper, which is just published in early view in the Information Systems Journal. That reports in a lot more detail about our experiences in Costa Rica, including some of the practical and operational lessons that we have learned, so some of the markers that we would change, and some of the methods that we might alter as well, and an awful lot about the ontology and the relationship of this field to the understanding at the moment of resilience in the information systems field. Or if you're interested in more practical guidance, then please take a look at the RABIT handbook, which has got all the tools and so on, all the various case studies of resilience and of e-resilience from both Costa Rica and Uganda at the website, which is nict.org/resilience. You're welcome, of course, to chat with me today or email me later if you'd like to discuss collaborations or if you'd like some further details about RABIT. I was going to talk for 20 minutes. How did it come to that? I guess we didn't, to be fair. We started quite early. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really interesting talk.
Yes.
Is RABIT still going on? Is it finished?
No, absolutely. It's the digital resilience project that we're putting in at the moment is going to use. It's going to use it. I mean, RABIT is just a
Project.
It's just a tool. It's not a specific. It's not a specific.
But it was funded
project.
by before.
Yeah, it came out of a project funded by IDRC, and then we got a little bit of money from Manchester and from Lutheran World Relief in order to put it into practice in Costa Rica and Uganda. Yeah, that's right.
Sorry, Richard. What the RABIT actually stands for? I know it's a toolkit.
Resilience, assessment, benchmarking, and impact toolkit.
Okay.
So the integrated model of capacities of the 8 attributes is sort of it's generic. It's as I say, we see it as a comprehensive model of resilience. The idea of the markers and the indicators and how you might measure them in the field. We have given you some tools for people who would like to go out and use that in the field.
As you referred, because you did two very dissimilar similar studies in dissimilar areas.
Yes.
And you got and some of the impact you register is more to do with the people perception. So so the tool can work in a community or to evaluate that community and looking from a baseline to see the impact of the intervention.
Yes.
But it cannot it doesn't let you compare between communities because it's very reliant on what was the initial what was the initial position of each community to understand what those markers.
As we've applied it, I think that's right. But as I was just mentioning, you could think of ways of trying to make it more objective and more quantified. I'm sure of that, which might give you more robust comparisons.
So in your attributes, you could imagine there are variables in a way to a certain extent, and you consider them as independent variables. Presumably there's a dependencies as well.
Yeah, no, that's right, and whether there are overlaps and so on. Yes, we've done that, but and you can see in what I indicated For example, here the intra-level networks and the social networks. There was some overlap that I would next time round in the field we would eliminate. But I'm fairly confident about the kinds of markers and so on that they don't overlap. I mean, part of the reflection that we did in the Information Systems Journal article was to work out where there were overlaps between those markers and then just try to eliminate those. But that's right. So I think even if there were concerns about the overlaps between the attributes, then the separation and the distinctiveness of the markers would mean that wasn't a major problem, because I'm fairly confident that all of these are part of the contribution towards resilience. Other things one could do, I've been suggested, for instance, is to get communities to weight these, because at the moment they're all given an equal weight. There are many ways of complexifying what we've done. Obviously, for a workable tool, you've got that balance between getting to the truth of the matter and having a tool that actually works, is workable in the field.
I was thinking, like, in terms of system dynamics point of view, if you look at learning, for example, if you invest in learning, that could have an impact on self-organization, because they have a better understanding about importance of local leaderships, maybe importance of consensus building kind of stuff. I was wondering whether there are
So, yeah, you could certainly see, so we call these the enabling properties, and so certainly we see those as feeding in those, and you could certainly see that there's a reinforcement circle between those three. Yeah, no, absolutely. It's certainly not that these are independent entities that sort of have no relationship. No, that's good.
Actually, I have two interesting questions, I guess.
You sure they're interesting?
Okay, I'm excited to apply this model for my new program for fintech and mobile banking. Now, if I want to take it as impact case study to be published in the future, what would be the time span required to implement this? Can you take a master project to do it?
You can do it at various levels. So I mean, in terms of the amount of time that we spent in the field, how long did we spend in the field with the communities? Maybe it was 2 weeks or something like that of work in the field. Maybe a little bit longer than that. I mean, there were times of kind of, obviously there were more than one visit, because we then had to analyse and go back to the community and present their results. But you can certainly do it. You can do it at a whole set of different levels. It's a bit like, how long is a piece of string? So master's students, absolutely, it's a master's project. It derives from and was a PhD student level project and so on. So yeah, you can certainly do that. And I think, one of the things we're wondering about is around fintech. There's a number of sort of shocks and stresses you can link those sorts of things to. You can link it to economic shocks and economic stresses in a general sense. You could link it more specifically to issues of unemployment. You could link it to people in economically stressed situations, refugees, humanitarian areas, and so on, where money is a real concern. So yeah, there are a number of different ways in which you can apply.
So would you be happy to collaborate on this and give us the tools?
Yeah, of course. I mean, all the stuff is there. anybody can take it and use it. But of course, part of the reason I'm here and I'm going around talking about this is that we have a real interest in seeing how this could be applied in other settings.
Maybe we can have online metrics for this.
Yeah. So that's one thing that was being developed. I'd have to check where that got to, but I mean, certainly in terms of it was getting towards an idea of an online survey, for example, that people would just fill in rather than the standard approach. Yeah, there's a number of developments that. So my collaborator Angelica Ospina went to work with Lutheran World Relief, worked with them on this and in looking at developing in various ways, and she's now working with the International Institute for Sustainable Development on some of the things. There's a number of sort of threads of directions that it's taken. Yeah, no, very interesting. Very interesting.
So lots of questions.
Come on.
Richard, what is the what is the three things difference between your resilience framework, means RABIT resilience framework or digital framework,
Yeah.
and the other resilience framework?
I think for ours, okay, so one thing that isn't particularly different is it's not radically new. I just, if you're interested in resilience frameworks, I don't know if you've seen it, ODI published in 2016 as part of the Resilience MEL Community of Practice, a review of 45 frameworks of resilience. That's a really interesting read to just understand. So they did that. They said 2/3 of frameworks use capacities to understand resilience. About half of them use assets. Inevitably, therefore, a number of them are combining capacities and assets. So ours is not radically different in saying, oh, we're coming at it from a completely new way of thinking. We are, as I said, concerned about the sort of lots of different frameworks, capacity-related frameworks that use a few of the attributes. And what we wanted to do was to create a comprehensive model that includes all of the attributes that are been identified from past research as being contributors to resilience. So that's the first thing I'd say, that it's comprehensive in terms of capacities and understanding the system properties that contribute to resilience in the system. The second thing I'd say is that we have operationalized it down to specific indicators that one can take into a community and ask about. And notwithstanding my point about interpretivism and being bottom-up and maybe changing them and so on, one could potentially have a comparative set of measures that one could use across community. So I think those are the two main things, that it's comprehensive and that it's clearly, you've got a clear how-to guide for just pick up and say, right, I want to go and apply this in a community or an organisation or whatever, how do I do that? It offers you that.
It's just like it's very interesting. Like you mentioned, gave an example of Costa Rica and Uganda.
Yeah.
In the disaster management community, or disaster management people working in Costa Rica, Latin America, they are more prefer to say instead of community, the local. Means like a RABIT is promoting local disaster management than the community-based disaster management.
Yeah.
Yeah. And when it comes to the Costa Rica, you have a language, they speak different language compared to Uganda.
This is correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
And when you go to the local level, means robustness, the meaning of the robustness might be different.
Right. That's right.
For the one area to another.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So how do you overcome this kind of problem?
Well, for what we've been doing so far, as I said, we don't, because we believe in this bottom-up, more subjective interpretation as being the way to tap into the realities of resilience within the communities. Were one to want to try to do a more cross-cutting, cross-community comparison, then I think you'd have to start thinking about that. And I mean, you'd be looking at more quantifiable measures, which of course a number of the other resilience indexes include, like I don't know, the number of local government employees within the community, the unemployment rate within the community, the mobile phone penetration rate within the community. And again, you'd start and look with these, and you'd probably do a bit of kind of community work within specific communities, thinking about what metrics could one use of these in order to create something that, whilst imperfect, clearly, it would not be as good a representation of resilience, I would say, as the more interpretive bottom-up indicator approach, but whilst imperfect, might allow for cross-community comparison. And you'd borrow from existing resilience indices as well. You'd start with a lit review of those, looking at what are the metrics that others are using, mapping those metrics to these attributes and markers, and seeing which of those could one make use of.
Are you happy to take a few more questions?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I think that's good. Yeah.
Thank you. In your third slide, when you talk about shocks and vulnerabilities, I mean, I noticed that all of the vulnerabilities are kind of not related to digital technology. So in the sense that you don't talk about e-shocks or e-stresses, like if you call it that, the stresses like the changes in the platforms and like things like Uber and Amazon, all the disruptions that they have on existing methods, and you know, so I mean that kind of like makes the whole idea of digital technology a positive only dimension. So when you go to the public and you're looking at a very interpretivistic, you know, because you're getting the people's perceptions and things like that, and don't you feel like, you know, most of the questions seem to be, you know, like framing digital technology as a positive aspect only, so you know that would affect the people's, you know, answers and things like that. So for example, you know, you wouldn't be looking at digital technology as you know, mobilization of disruptive elements in a community, like for example using Facebook or WhatsApp or things like that for, you know, disruptions in the community where, like if you have tensions like racial tensions or something like that, that leads to issues in the communities. But that's not really, so these are kind of like, so you've got the resilience aspect of it and then you've got the disruptive aspect of it. So is that something you look at in the framework as well? Or?
Every resilience framework, if you look at it, has path dependencies. And it comes out of, you know, you look at urban resilience frameworks, and they come up with kind of development literature, you look at disasters, and they come up with disaster literature and so on. And I'm from a development studies institute, and so we're shaped by development studies, particularly the livelihoods framework and notions of context and vulnerability. So I think that's partly shaped. That might explain sort of the direction that we've come at. I like the idea that we are looking generally at shocks and vulnerabilities overall. I think that's really important. I don't think you can sort of, if you think about the lives of people in low-income communities, they don't kind of separate out these components, but then it's all a mass of different things that they're facing, and I think we need to incorporate all of them. So I think the general notion of starting with a whole range of contexts of stresses and shocks and the whole range of vulnerabilities, I think that's the right way to do that. So the next point of yours is, should we include kind of ICT-related shocks? I think that's really interesting, and I'd like to say, yeah, we should have a think about that. I guess the reason we didn't is because the kinds of communities we're looking at, they're relatively new to ICTs. ICTs are not so strongly embedded. So there's only a little bit of Facebook and so on in the communities we're looking at. But you look at the trajectory, and of course it's getting higher and higher, and all of that notion of the more digitally interconnected, the more digitally vulnerable it becomes. Yeah. So I think that's really, so point one, yes, that's a great idea. And we should.
I was just adding something to his question. Mikey Newman had a paper about destructive technologies. With Amani Blana, maybe I can
No, that's good. Yeah. So ICTs are shot. Number one, that's interesting. Number two, one of the things I've been kind of thinking about, because we're doing this proposal on digital resilience, is kind of thinking, this is a generic framework, but what would it look like if we said, well, the USP of this framework is it's specifically about ICTs. How might we reinterpret the attributes? How might we look at the indicators differently? I haven't got an answer to that, but I thought that's an interesting possibility. Pros and cons of ICTs. We did ask about that. I have to be honest, it was a little bit of a battle between myself and my co-worker, because her view was ICTs are great. And I was kind of saying, yeah, but you know, ICTs can weaken as well as strengthen. And one of the problems is we had to cut the number of questions, and I noticed that as we were cutting, it seemed to be the questions about ICTs weakening resilience that somehow got lost.
Yeah.
But absolutely, we do take the view. And to be fair, we did get evidence about that people came up with about the notion of for example, that Facebook and social media generally was creating a greater feeling of isolation within the Costa Rican community. So we were not as balanced as I would have liked to be in the questions we were asking, but in its essence, it's absolutely understood that digital interventions can weaken as well as strengthen resilience, and one needs to be very much aware of that. Of course, we're trying to set priorities for how we can use ICTs to strengthen. So yeah, great.
Sorry, just following on from that.
Yeah.
Taking the benchmark as it is. So you look at the results, and you said that it was a longitudinal study. You were saying that it was I think you mentioned longitudinal as opposed to a cross-sectional.
No,
Is it
cross-sectional?
cross-sectional?
No, I mean, no, it was that.
Yeah. Because I mean, the one thing that would change people's perceptions quite radically is ICT. It's ironically like you take people's perception and stuff, but the thing that can change it the fastest would be digital technology.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you were doing a longitudinal study, you'd have that challenge, of course, with your
Yeah.
sort of attribution of, well, what was it from time 1 to time 2 that really caused changes in the strength of the attributes that they're recording. We haven't done a longitudinal study, so I haven't had to grapple with that as yet.
Okay, so you.
Thank you. Looking at it from the mathematical point of view, is there a general model that would describe a system for a developed system and a developing system? Or both systems have different models to describe them? Just trying to look at how we can make future predictions of each of these variables or parameters.
Yeah, I have to admit that although I have read up on that kind of approach and understanding of systems and also complexity theory and so on, that is not my strength. So I unfortunately would not be able to give a coherent answer to that question.
Did you want to come? Yeah, right, sorry.
Richard, I guess I'm interested in the impact. How do you think you could assess whether the toolkit has in fact increased resilience? Applying the toolkit has increased resilience.
Well, it's not applying the toolkit, of course, that increases resilience. It would be because what we're doing with the toolkit is setting priorities for interventions, and then you want to look at those interventions and see the extent to which they've done that. So
let me rephrase the question
Yeah.
then. How would you know that the prioritisation of your interventions has been?
right. So what we would ideally like to do. Right, if you spare Bob on you, could do a survey. Then would be to go back to the two communities and to redo the benchmarking of both resilience and e-resilience and have a look at how they've changed over time. That's what you want to do.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for this amazing talk. I think there was lots of discussion.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.